Alright, I'm going to be going over how to make a basic flower, but instead of relying entirely on the default mesh shapes, we're going to actually be drawing with the vertices ourselves. So just to get started, I want to remind you that you want to make sure that the key map is set to right click to select. So when you first open Blender, there'll be an option to choose left click or right click. You want to choose right click. If you did not do that, a lot of the shortcuts that I mentioned are not going to be accurate. So you can always fix that by just coming to the edit menu, preferences, key map, and then right for selecting. All right, first of all, I'm not going to be using the cube at all, so I'm just going to press X to delete that. I have my collection with the camera and the light. I'm going to toggle the collection off so that I can hide it, just so that it's out of the way. And the great thing about organizing with collections is you can easily hide groups of objects and then show them when you need them. I'm going to just click over on Scene Collection so that it's active. You can see that blue highlight. If I right click, I can create a new collection. And this collection, I'm just going to double click to rename it, is going to be for my flowers. And now that that's renamed and active, here I want to just make sure that my pivot point is in the center of the grid. It already is, but if yours got off center, you can press Shift S and then cursor to world origin. All right, so I'm going to add a plane just to give me an object to start with. So Shift A, mesh, and then plane. And I always like to name things descriptively so that I know what's what. And this is just going to be some sort of flower. And I'm just going to head into edit mode, and I'm actually going to delete all of the vertices. If it's not already selected, you can just press A to select everything, X to delete, and I'm going to delete all the vertices. Notice that the object is still in the outliner, and it still has this little origin here in the center. Now I'm going to switch over to a top view, so I can press the Z icon or 7 on the number pad. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. And now I'm going to start drawing with vertices just for the left side of my flower petal to make sort of an arc. So Control, left click, Control, left click. Whenever you are adding vertices, with Control left click, they'll be connected to whatever vertices are active, so you do want to be careful about what's selected. Control left click and Control left click. Now I want to remind you, you can always move the vertices if you realize you didn't put something in the right spot. So I can right click on it, slide things around if I want to adjust the positions at all. All right, I'm just going to go back to the select tool so that the widget's not in the way. And I'm going to be starting to make the center of this flower petal. And I'm going to be creating groups of 4 vertices as I'm making the center. Because again, we always want to keep our faces to quads instead of ngods. So groups of 4 whenever we possibly can. Whenever we're drawing with the vertices ourselves, we can make sure we have those groups of 4. So I'm going to parallel to the selected vertex, just about on the y-axis, Control left click, go a little bit further down, parallel to the next one, Control left click, and now I'm going to select the group of 4. I can press B to box select, or that's also the default selection method when you have the select tool active, then F to make my first face. I'm going to right click on this bottom vertex so that only that one is active. Control left click. You can also use C for brush select. Right click to get out. Then F to make a face. I'm just going to keep repeating this process. So Control left click. Use any of the selection methods to select all 4 vertices, F to make a face. Now, you do really want to be careful what you have selected. If I do Control left click now, I get this crazy shape going on because it's connected to all of the vertices that are active. So I'm just going to Command Z to undo. So I want to be really strategic. Now I'm going to use a different technique to get the faces on the lower half. I'm just going to press E to extrude. And notice when I'm extruding, it just extrudes a connected edge because I only have a vertex selected. And I'm going to just press Y to lock my movement to the Y axis and left click to keep the location. I'm going to switch to edge select for a moment. I'm just going to right click to select my edge, W for the context menu, and I'm going to subdivide. Right now that's added one extra vertex, but I want to have two of them, so I'm just going to increase the number of cuts. Now when I switch back to vertex select, you can see that I have the correct number of vertices. And so whatever selection method, whether it's B for box select, C for brush select, I can select groups of 4, F to make a face. I can also just hold down on Shift as I right click, F to make a face, and F to make a face. There we go. Now I'm going to be extruding the middle to make the right side. If I've formed this properly, I can hold Option, right click on the edge, and it'll select the entire edge. If that doesn't work for you, then there's something that's a little bit off with your vertices. There are a couple of things that you can do. One thing, when you have everything selected with A, is you can press M and then merge by distance. If you have any vertices that are exactly overlapping, that will get rid of the ones that are overlapping. You can also increase the merge distance so that it starts increasing the number of, the distance that it'll actually merge. In this case, I don't want to do that because I don't have any overlapping. All right, and if Option right click still doesn't work after that, you can just select using one of the other selection methods. All right, so my selection looks perfect. I'm just going to press E to extrude and then X to lock that movement to the X axis. And I want to just decide how far I want this to come out. I want it to be fairly similar to the other side, and then just a left click to keep it. And then from here, I'm just going to move the vertices so that it's sort of mirroring the left side. And it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect because in nature, things are not actually perfectly symmetrical the vast majority of the time. There are always slight differences. And so if I have that in my flower petal, it'll actually make it feel a little bit more realistic. So I don't have to worry so much about it having it be absolutely perfect. So this is probably just fine. All right, now I want to make this flower petal more three-dimensional. You can see that it's super flat looking, which just doesn't look realistic. So if I go into quad view, that's Option Control Q to go in and out of quad view. And I'm going to select the vertices in the middle. So again, I should be able to do Option right click, but you can do one of the other selection methods if you need to. I'm going to turn on proportional editing right over here. And I can change the type of fall off. I'm probably just going to leave smooth, but certainly feel free to experiment. So when I pull the handle down, if I drag my finger on the mouse, I can change the amount of proportional editing so that I'm moving more or less with a single movement. Sometimes it's easier just to press G to grab and then maybe Z for the Z axis, and then you can drag your fingers on the mouse a little bit more easily. Either way is completely fine. I'm just adding a little bit of a bend, and you can decide exactly how intense you want that to be. You may have noticed, but only the top right window actually changes. The other ones are always the top, the front, and the right view. Right, so that looks pretty good. Now I want to have a little bit of a taper on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to grab just a single vertex, and I'm just going to grab this with G. I can play around with the amount of proportional editing. I might want to press Z to lock my movement to the Z axis if I want to keep it really straight, or maybe I don't. It's okay if it's a little bit organic. So maybe something like that. Gonna try to grab vertex in the middle over here. Maybe this time I want to lock it to the Y axis. Again, I can play around with the amount of proportional editing. All right, so I think something like that looks good. You can play around with the exact silhouette that you want for the flower petal, but that definitely looks more interesting. At this point, I'm going to exit quad view, Control Option Q to go in and out. And now I'm going to start getting ready to duplicate my flower petal. I'm going to press the period key and I'm going to set the pivot behavior to the 3D cursor. That way, whenever I left click, it'll move the pivot location to exactly where I want it. So something like that is probably okay. I don't want the pivot to be too close to the flower petal itself. Now I can either press A to select everything, or I could also press L for loose part to select my flower petal. I'm going to do Shift D to duplicate, R to rotate, and it's rotating around that pivot location. And I can decide exactly where I want the flower petals to be. Generally speaking, I recommend not having things overlap, but with the case of the flower, it makes it look like there are some additional petals, which can be interesting. I think I'm going to leave a little bit of space, but I could do it that way. I'm just going to keep repeating this process. Shift D to duplicate, R to rotate, left click to keep the new location. If you end up losing your selection and you need to get it back, you can hover over a flower petal and press L because it's a loose part. It'll select just that area. So again, Shift D to duplicate, R to rotate. Now, depending on the size of your flower petals and the amount of space you put between them, you may end up with a bigger gap than you necessarily want. So you can play around with the placement of some other petals. If you just right click in the background, it'll deselect. So I can press L. Oh, and actually, because I have proportional editing on right now, I might want to actually turn that off. So now when I go back to R to rotate, it's not moving other things. So right click in the background to deselect, L for loose part, R for rotate, and I'm going to leave it like that. Again, it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. It's okay to let it be organic. All right, next up, I'm going to be adding the center of my flower. I'm actually going to add it off to the side. And so I'm just moving the pivot point just by left clicking. Shift A for the add menu. I'm going to add a UV sphere. And I'm going to go to one of the side views and I'm going to toggle on wireframe, and it has X-ray on at the same time. You'll notice when you turn X-ray on, or when you turn wireframe on, X-ray should be enabled. And you can also press Z to go to the different shading options. Now I'm going to just click and drag. I could also use B for box select to select the bottom half. It's going to be X to delete. And depending on what part I have, I might be deleting the vertices, I might be deleting the faces. In this case, I'm going to go with faces. That looks good. I'm going to select the vertex that's in the center there. Maybe proportional editing back on. I'm going to go more for a sphere this time, I think. And I'm just going to pull that down and sort of flatten the top a little bit. And you can play around with the amount of proportional editing. Just a reminder, Shift scroll to pan, Control scroll to zoom. All right, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to switch back into solid shading. I'm going to just hover over the center of my flower and press L again for loose part. And I'm just going to move this, actually turn off proportional editing, and line it up with my flower. This might be a good opportunity to go back into quad view, so Control Option Q, because that way I can adjust from multiple angles to make sure that the positioning looks correct. All right, that looks pretty good. Control Option Q to get out of quad view. Shift S, cursor to world origin. Before I do this, A to select everything, R to rotate, X for the X axis, and 90 degrees, and a left click to keep the change in rotation. So now my flower is facing front. All right, next up is going to be the stem. I'm going to, somewhere in the back over here, just move the pivot point. And keep in mind, if it's not exactly in the perfect ideal location, whatever I'm adding, I'll be able to adjust later on. So it's not necessarily super important as long as it's in the general area. Shift A for the add menu. This time I'm going to add a circle. Just like before, I'm going to change the rotation. So R to rotate, X for the X axis, 90 for 90 degrees. And that's all set. Now this is going to be the beginning of the stem. I'm just going to slide it towards the back side. So something about like that. And from a side view, I'm just going to press E to extrude, maybe Y to lock it to the Y axis, left click to keep the change in location, S to scale. Now notice that it's really scaling towards the pivot point. So I might want to move, just with a left click, the pivot point to another location so that I can control the scaling a little bit more. So something like that. Maybe I also want to slide this a little bit down. I can experiment with what I like the look of. Maybe I went a little too far back. I can experiment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to do some extruding. First, I'm going to adjust the rotation a little bit. And notice that the location of the pivot point has a big impact. So if I move the pivot point right below, I'll be able to control the tilt a lot better. So E to extrude a little ways. I might want to start locking that to the Y axis, slide it a little further down, maybe a little bit more back. Might move to the transform tool so I can do this at the same time. Move the pivot location, adjust the rotation a little bit. Adjusting the rotation is actually a really important step, or the stem is going to end up ending super thin towards the base. E to extrude, left to keep the change in location. Sometimes it's easier just to move the widget further away, and then where you actually want it, adjusting the rotation a little bit. And I'm just going to do this until I'm happy with the length and the placement of the stem. I can always lock the extrusion to a specific axis, but also if it's not perfectly straight, that might just feel more realistic, so that would be okay. Maybe I want to scale. Let's move the pivot point a little bit lower. Maybe I want to scale that so it gets a little bit wider at the base, and sort of play around with what makes sense. You can see if we look straight on, the stem's not perfectly straight, but again, that's just going to help it feel more realistic. All right, I'm going to head over into object mode and see what that looks like. In the object menu, I'm just going to look at the shading options. Right now it's shade flat. I might want to go with shade smooth, or it may be that shade auto smooth is a better option, so it'll choose which parts should be smooth and which parts should be flat. You can also in the edit menu, select specific faces, and in the face menu, specifically set those faces to smooth or flat, depending on what makes sense. So a few ways you can do that there. All right, so I think that that looks fine. I'm going to start working on some materials. So when I come over, well, actually, before I work with materials, I'm going to turn my collection with the light and the camera back on. I'm going to switch over to the rendered shading. All right. Now, when I have time, I like to use the cycles engine for the materials because it's going to give a much better result. Eevee is a lot faster, so when you don't have time or when you're actively modeling and animating, it's better to leave it at Eevee. But when you're handling the materials specifically, or when you're ready to render, switching to cycles is going to just give you better looking result the majority of the time. All right, so I have that set to cycles. My light is active. I'm going to come over to the lamp settings. I'm going to switch to the sun. Notice that the strength is way too strong. Somewhere between 6 and 10 is usually a pretty good strength. The sun is a light source that's far off in the distance. It doesn't matter where it's located. What matters is the angle that the light is coming in. So I can experiment with that. And actually the angle that I'm in when I'm changing the angle of the lamp will have an impact. And I can always just type that over here. But that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go back to my flower. I'm going to the materials, plus new. I can change the surface type. There are all sorts of materials. Just make sure you're not leaving the default because it's so boring if everything's the same. Like if you use principled BSDF, it can do some great things, but change the settings to make it interesting. Or change the surface type. Maybe I'll go with diffuse. This might be for my flower petals. Now you'll notice that the first material applies to everything. I can click on plus to make another material slot, plus new to create the material. And actually, maybe I'll do this again. Plus to make a slot, plus new to make the material. This is going to be orange petals. This is going to be a yellow center. And this is going to be a green stem. For the stem, maybe I'll go with glossy. Notice it's not actually applying anywhere yet. To actually add additional materials, I need to go into edit mode. And I need to select whatever faces I want to apply it to. Because I've added the stem starting from a separate circle, I can just press L for loose part to select the whole thing. And then I can assign those vertices to that material. And similarly for the center, if I hover over the middle, I can press L and assign that different material. I'm just going to switch back into object mode so I can see the materials a little bit more clearly. Now for the center, I think I'm going to do a mix shader. It is my favorite because it allows you to do just some really interesting combinations. So I'm going to do emission as one of the materials, which really glows, which is really cool. And for the second material, maybe I'll go with glass. All right, now I can change the color of my different materials. A little too green there, I think. Okay. The factor controls which material has more of an impact. If I go all the way to 0, it's only using the first shader. If I go all the way to 1, it's only using the second shader. And so I can play around with which one has more influence. With emission, you can add more of a glow by increasing the strength. And so you can just do some really interesting things by using the mix shaders where you're combining different materials together. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to switch to the material preview for a little while. It's going to be faster processing, but you're going to notice that the materials aren't as as accurate. Like it doesn't show the material with light impacting it, which is what really makes the material work. I'm going to duplicate my flower, so I have a couple of them. So Shift D to duplicate, Shift D again. So I'm just going to have a couple flowers here. That looks good. Now, if I want to change one of my materials, they are all linked to each other. When you have a duplicate, the materials are automatic and some of the other data is automatically linked. Sometimes that's great. You want everything to be the same, so you want to be able to change one thing to change something else. But sometimes it's not super helpful. So if you go in the Object menu, you can go under Relations, Make Single User, and you either want Object and Data and Materials or just Materials. Notice that the number got added to the end of the name over here. Naming your materials is actually really helpful because you might want to reuse them in other files later on. And so if you have descriptive names for things, it makes it a lot easier. I'm going to do maybe blue petals. And maybe I'll change the roughness. All right. And I'm going to make this one a single user as well. So Object, Relations, Single User. Again, one of the options with materials doesn't really matter which one. This one is going to be purple petals. Actually, I think I want this to be a different material entirely. I'm going to go with glossy. Can play around with the roughness. Lots of settings that I can adjust to really customize what this is going to look like. All right, so I think that looks good. Next up, I'm going to just switch back to the rendered view, and I'm going to add a color for the world background. So we have the world background right here. If I just want a solid color, I can click on the color field and then choose whatever color it is that I think complements my flowers. Alternatively, I can click on the little circle to the left right here, and there are some different textures that I can do instead. Sky texture or environment texture are the ones you might use. Environment texture would be if you're wrapping an image around. Sky texture will give you a sky. Nishida is the best out of the different skies because you can customize it the most, like the amount of air versus dust versus ozone has a huge impact on how everything looks. So you can get some really interesting effects depending on how you change and customize the different settings. And if you realize, I do just want a solid color, you can just click on sky texture and remove it, and it gets you back to the solid color. All right, next up is I need to set my camera angle. You can press 0 on the number pad to toggle in and out of the camera view. Now, the camera is not looking where I want it to. You can also click on this little button right here. So I'm going to line up the view with something close with what I want to look at, but a little bit zoomed out. So maybe something like this. I'm going to head to the View menu, Align View, and then Align Active Camera to View. From here, I can right-click on the edge of the camera, and I can just adjust the exact location. I can also click on the camera in the outliner to select it. And from here, I can render my image. When we're using cycles, it takes a little bit of time. This one shouldn't be too bad because I don't have that much going on, but there are certainly some settings that you can adjust if you want to speed things up. You can take a look on the website for the recommendations as far as that goes. When the render is completely finished, the time remaining will be gone and the time that it took will be stationary here. And then there'll be an option to actually save here. And you just want to save this somewhere on your computer. And that is it. Oh, well, one last thing. Don't forget to actually save your file and give it a descriptive name. All right, and that is it.